What's the largest ethnicity in the United States of America? English, German, Irish? What do these labels really mean, anyways? In modern America, what's the difference between a Russian or Italian descendant? They're all the same, right? Although some people tend to use the terms race, ethnicity, nationality, or ancestry interchangeably, this is nowhere near the truth of the situation. And first we need to define what an ethnicity is. And this is going to be a somewhat long tangent that will likely tie into an upcoming video I have planned. We, as Americans, don't tend to think of the world in terms of ethnicity the way the rest of the planet does. I remember when I first started self-educating over global demographics, I was incredibly shocked to learn that there are detectable and measurable average genetic differences between different groups of people within the same race, as we just aren't taught about that kind of stuff in our curriculum. Before this, I had just assumed that all white people or black people were pretty much the same, yet just so happened to speak different languages, but this is incredibly ignorant of reality. This creates huge misconceptions among Americans when they think of the so-called Asian race, Indian race, Hispanic race, or even the Caucasian race, as I might discuss in an upcoming video, because of the common vernacular that has been imposed on us since childhood and reinforced through media. And it's mind-blowing when you learn the intricacies and complex patterns of migration, separation, and intermixing that result in the genetic layout of the planet that is far more complicated than most people, including myself, could possibly wrap our heads around, although I am learning more with every video. I think that genetic testing companies such as 23andMe or Ancestry.com have done a really great job of educating the American public and the world on the true nature of ethnicity and ancestry, which isn't so simple to define or quantify. Essentially, an ethnicity is a group of people, of any size really, who share a particular ancestral and or cultural background and is very similar to the concept of a nation, although ethnic lines do not and have almost never lined up exactly with national borders due to the way that humans splinter, migrate, and evolve into different subgroups and drastically diverge, sometimes in a relatively short time frame. Race is the underlying genetic component that goes far deeper than the surface level traits of ethnic groups such as culture, language, customs, traditions, or religion, although in the common vernacular, sometimes these do have quite a large effect as well. For instance, some Christian Lebanese migrants to the US or Latin America will consider themselves to be white and marry into the white majority within a couple generations or so, but this is almost never true of Muslim Lebanese. So historically, countries were generally built around a single ethnic group, and even multi-ethnic empires such as the Romans or Austria-Hungary generally had one dominant group. However, the European colonization of the Americas has complicated this significantly. Unlike many other countries around the world, the bulk of nations in the Americas have no single ethnic core population due to the fact that they are generally the result of a fusion of many different ethnicities over a relatively short time period. For instance, the ethnic group for Germany is obviously Germans, France, Frenchmen, Serbia, Serbs, although these don't always align perfectly along national borders. But for the United States or Canada, what would the core identity be? White? Clearly, white or European is not an ethnicity, and for that matter, neither is Hispanic, Black, Asian, or Native American. These are simply terms that have slipped into the common vernacular as tools in understanding the different groupings of mankind for historic and political reasons, and are a vast oversimplification of not only the global situation, but also that of the United States itself, as obviously in terms of nation building, so-called racial solidarity is a relatively recent concept. A pseudo-ethnicity is a group of people who are treated as an ethnicity in common vernacular, yet did not form in the traditional sense of ethnogenesis, wherein a localized group of people intermarry and develop a somewhat homogenized gene pool, culture, and language. There are many groups in the U.S. that act as a de facto pseudo-ethnicity, and this includes many groups that are recent immigrant arrivals, but focusing on the old stock communities that have been developing for hundreds of years, we can see that the groups in America that do act as pseudo-ethnicities are mostly of European descent, although it does get a bit more complicated than this. One of the pseudo-ethnic groups in America that I recently discussed would be inhabitants of Appalachia, or Appalachia as it's known locally, who are dispersed throughout Pennsylvania, Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and many other states, and are predominantly English, German, or Scots-Irish ancestry, with the vast majority having some sort of ethnically mixed heritage. I stated in that video that because their ancestors had been in America for hundreds of years, they no longer identified with their countries of origin in Europe and simply identify as American, and I've personally met many people who think this way. I've seen the same argument made for other areas of the United States that have a strong regional identity, such as New England, an area that is much more ethnically diverse than Appalachia, with large populations of Irish, Italians, Portuguese, French, and other more recent immigrant communities, with the older communities somewhat blending into each other over many generations, although due to a high rate of emigration from this region to other parts of the country, relatively few people today are of colonial stock when compared to those in Appalachia. Some have also stated that white Southerners as a whole are a de facto separate ethnic group in the United States, with a highly divergent dialect, culture, and ancestry when compared to the other regions of the country. And historically, white Southerners who moved to other parts of the country typically stuck together in their own communities, as can be seen in their movement to California and the West Coast during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Even then, taking this to the extreme, one could say that each state itself has a strong regional identity and therefore have become the de facto ethnic identifiers in America in the present day, which is definitely true for the larger states such as California, New York, Florida, or especially Texas, which I would argue has the strongest regional identity of any state. And whenever people ask what nationality I am in the comments section, sometimes I jokingly state Texan, of course, but I reckon it'd be quite difficult to find someone who identifies as a New Hampshireite or Wyomingite. And yes, I had to actually look up the descriptors for people from these states because I had never heard them. No offense. Not to mention, this could cause confusion as when using the labels Hawaiian or Alaskan, as it could be referring to the general inhabitants of these states, or more specifically to the indigenous peoples that predated recent outside immigration. It does seem rather odd that an area and population of comparable size, that being Europe, would have such a huge diversity of nations and languages when compared to the United States, which has one of the most ethnically diverse origins of any country on the planet. Other groups that act as a pseudo-ethnic collective that are bound together from a religious angle include the Amish, a predominantly German-descended people originating in Pennsylvania and spreading out mostly to other states in the Midwest, and are quite similar to the Mennonites, who are spread out throughout Latin America, the Mormons, who are a modern religious group that I have argued in the past acts as an ethnic group in most contexts in America, at least those who are non-converts and of the older stock Mormon pioneer descent. But none of these groups are really the quintessential American identity, and maybe there is none, but there has been a term coined in the 1950s by sociologists to describe the predominant ancestry, that being white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASP as it was known, which is not really a professionally used term, but one that puts a label on this anomalous group, even if it is slightly facetious. At the onset of independence from the British Empire, the Anglo-Protestants made up around half of the U.S. population, falling from nearly 3/4 at the beginning of the 1700s, and this number has continued to decline as more European and later global immigrants poured into the country. By 1980, they were only a fourth, and in the present day, only 8% of Americans self-identify as English. You might be asking how this could be when those of English heritage are very obviously predominant in media, entertainment, and politics, but in fact many with English surnames are in fact Anglicanized from Irish, German, Swedish, Dutch, or other European nations in an attempt to assimilate into the prevailing population. For example, Schmidt became Smith, Mueller became Miller, and there are some Welsh or Irish surnames that I won't even begin to try and pronounce. But also, it is accepted that this 8% number, even today, is a vast undercount, as many Anglo-Americans instead identify under the American ancestry on the U.S. Census, which was added in 1990, and ever since, around 5 to 8% of the American public identifies with this label, most prominently in the Virginias, Carolinas, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas, highly correlating with the Appalachian homeland. As I discussed in my Appalachia video, the vast majority of those who identify in this manner are of predominantly English and Scots-Irish stock, although this varies considerably by region and is hence not a homogeneous group. It's similar to how a large chunk of the Canadian population identifies as ethnically Canadian on their census, with a large number in just about every province, although conversely, the bulk of those who identify as Canadian are actually of French ancestry rather than English, as Canada was originally a French colony. So, is this the typical WASP described by sociologists of the past? Well, I would argue that there really is no such thing as simply an Anglo-Saxon American anymore, and this was recognized even back in the late 1800s when demographers and the general public alike noted that the average American was incredibly ethnically mixed, with such complicated and interconnected patterns of international and regional migration within communities that in the present day, only around 40% of non-Hispanic white Americans identify with only one ancestry on the U.S. Census. And in reality, this number would likely be even lower when looking back just a few generations. If I were to see the same genotypic or phenotypic clustering, or even solid cultural similarities among self-identified white Americans, then yes, I'd be tempted to declare that a new nation was created in the Americas. However, as it stands, I just don't think that enough time has passed and there hasn't been enough in-group endogamous intermixing to say for sure, and due to the current diversification of the American public at large, it's unknown if this will ever occur. However, there are some sociologists and ethnologists such as Eric Kaufman who claim that due to the high degree of intermixing between self-identified Hispanic and Asian Americans with whites, around 50 and 40% respectively among the second generation, their destiny is to be absorbed and assimilated into the dominant and prevailing population, similar to what occurred in India or Latin America, which is certainly possible but would take many, many generations, and by then who knows if ethnicity in the colloquial sense would even be relevant anymore, although I believe historic studies will forever be of value. So please let me know your thoughts on these interesting concepts of migration, assimilation, intermixing, and regionalization that have resulted in the modern ethnic, cultural, and socio-political landscape of the United States. And for today's poll, let me know if there's another country or area you'd like me to do a similar analysis on in this age of changing demographics. As always, thank you all so much for watching. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.